For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engle. This is Cybertide, a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com. I'm talking today with Mark Sangster. Mark is the Vice President, Chief of Strategy at Adlumin. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Heather.
We're talking today about an article that Adlumin recently published on their blog about understanding supply chain management. Can you take us through this article and just give us a little bit of a summary?
Yeah, absolutely. So supply chain has become one of, I think, the biggest vulnerabilities in general that companies face. And when I write articles, I always use some sort of story that has nothing to do with cybersecurity, and then I bring it back. And I think that SolarWinds, that big first attack that occurred with Orion, was, I think, the one that really established the line in the sand, right? And said, okay, vendors have to be responsible, but at the same time, the customer also has to be responsible and really has to consider what the impact can be, what the scope can be. And then, of course, sort of lining up the types of attacks that we see. And then ultimately, how do you prevent those? What are some of the tactics and the techniques and, the policies and procedures that we can put in place to protect ourselves?
You mentioned tactics and techniques and procedures. Can you talk with us about what some of these novel attack vectors are and what would be some potential countermeasures?
I kind of put supply chain risk into two buckets. One is the exploitation of a supply chain element. So I mentioned SolarWinds. That would be a good example. MoveIt, Acelion. There's been a whole bunch of these. LastPass is a password vault where effectively at source, those organizations are in some way exploited, and that exploit is then used to target the downstream customer base. The other one is where it's somehow manipulated and defeated. And so there's that trust model. And so I think of things like multi-factor authentication bypass type of techniques. I think the first one is the most dangerous. And ultimately, I put it down into three big buckets, right? One of them is policies, having the right understanding of why you work with a vendor in the first place. And we can dive into that. The protections, what responsibilities do each players in the customer-vendor relationship have? Who's responsible for what's a division of duty? How do we assess the risk and put whatever mitigation strategies are in place? And then ultimately the promises, or as, the contract part of it, right? The lawyers love. So what are the obligations? How do we demark responsibility? Minimum security requirements, notification, things like that.
One of the things that I really liked about this article is they, as we mentioned, explored some unique attack vectors. Can you talk about what some of the most vulnerable points are in the supply chain? This article ran through a few: vendor access attack, and they gave the example of the target data breach. They talked about vendor backdoor access. You mentioned SolarWinds. Can you take us through a few of those?
Absolutely. So, the problem with supply chain is that it's not two dimensions, it's three dimensions. So each supplier, think about if you're the ultimate, the end stop, you're the customer, you have a supplier. Well, that supplier is going to have other elements within it, and particularly in technology. Like Target's a great example, right? It was their HVAC vendor. That's who was hacked. And they used the trust relationship between that vendor to get into Target, to ultimately deploy malware to be able to collect up, credit card information and so on. And, the rest is kind of history, as we'd say. In the case of SolarWinds, it wasn't about an element there. What they did in that case is they were able to infiltrate the SolarWinds organization in the development area using administrative credentials. And then once they were in, they were able to modify code. They were actually erasing things like logs and so on. So even the developers of SolarWinds didn't know that it was happening. There was no evidence of this occurring. And then, of course, when a customer downloaded SolarWinds Orion, which is their management tool, and when they were using it, the bad guys were able then to sort of pull the trigger per se and deploy ransomware through that tool. And again, it's a trust relationship. That backdoor is nasty because you've got that open internet connection. It is trusted. Your firewalls are going to ignore what comes through it. Likely your endpoint technology is not seeing what's going on. And that's where it becomes more dangerous. And in some of the cases, they're real simple. Like I used some of those examples of things like file sharing tools. Well, in that case, you're trusting them. You're putting confidential information into them with the assumption that they are safe. Or LastPass, you're assuming that your username and password credentials have remained safe. And then they get exposed. And that's the problem, right? And it becomes real tough to open the aperture and expand what you're willing to protect. Most companies are already struggling protecting their own businesses, their own fortress. Well, now they got to figure out how to trust every partner and every ally and their allies and so on. And that's the thing, like I said, it's a complex relationship that's multidimensional, and code, like in IT, it's never simple. SolarWinds or whoever it might be is probably using open source code, and they're pulling other things, and nobody wants to reinvent the wheel. So if there's a calendaring widget or a timekeeping widget or whatever it is, they're just pulling that stuff in. And cloud-based technology, the same thing with Lambda and so on. So the problem is if something occurs in one of those spots, it goes downstream, and bad guys are really smart about this stuff. They know how to find that vulnerability, exploit it, and get to the end targets, which are customers. That's when we see the great damage. And we see, like we saw with SolarWinds as an example, because it affected so many government and military agencies, that there was a lot of concern over that exposure, and it becomes public pretty fast.
You mentioned something that I'd like to ask you to expand on, which is a lot of organizations are having enough trouble managing their own security. So how do they strike a balance between streamlining their supply chains, making sure that their supply chains are also putting security controls around their information? Is there a way to do that efficiently? How can we do that if we're already feeling resource constrained within our own organization?
Part of this, I think, comes down to the size of the parties in the relationship, right? Who's the big fish and who's the little fish? So you know what I mean? If you're using, for example, cloud-based service, whatever that is, Oracle, Amazon, Microsoft, whoever it might be, and you're a smaller organization, the reality is you're going to get their standard due diligence. They're going to talk about being SOC 2 certified and whatever, and that's all good. We are too. It is a critical tool in the toolbox. But it's going to be tough to kind of go deeper than that. In smaller organizations, you might want to conduct more due diligence. In fact, I do that for our organization. So when customers are coming on board, I have a DDQ package I have to give them, and we have to deal with it and go through it and answer all the questions and so on. But I think ultimately, even when you don't have full control of that relationship, you know enough to know what to do. So if you can't guarantee, I guess, the security posture of whoever that vendor is, first, I'd probably be asking if I should be using them. But if I'm forced to, say there's a business decision that says, look, we need this to be competitive and they're our only choice, then it becomes, all right, so what else am I going to do then? How am I going to shore up that gap? So I can't block it at their end, but is there something I can put in place at my end to sort of detect some aberrant activity? And that's why I say it's kind of about understanding those protections, the second P. So identifying what data goes back and forth. And you obviously are an expert in this area. Whatever information is flowing back and forth, so to understand what that looks like and what the obligations are that come along with it. Defining what kind of risk appetite you have. I mean, I think this is a big deal. I see this all the time with companies. They want to buy a new technology, and the business side buys it because it has some kind of advantage, right? New markets, cheaper access to market, new things to sell, whatever it is. And, it gets thrown over IT, and it's like, well, make it secure. And meanwhile, had they been involved in the contractual stages, they could have imprinted some of those things, understanding the risks and then defining those requirements. So even if the vendor themselves can't provide it, then you have to ask yourself, is there critical information that we just have to make sure the vendor doesn't get into? Like, we don't want them touching our critical database because they don't need to. And that's where our secret sauce is. Versus if they do have to access that kind of information, then what am I going to do about it? Even when they're using a trusted backdoor like this, like a vendor relationship, at some point they have to touch and move around and, do that sort of thing in your environment. And all of those are going to create some kind of evidence or signs or signals, at least the precursors that something bad is happening.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Adlumin Inc. provides enterprise-grade security to mid-market organizations. Its security operations platform and managed detection and response services combines all your data into one view to illuminate security risks and accelerate security workflows. Security teams are often stretched thin and are faced with increasing threats to respond to like ransomware and data theft. Adlumin's patented technology simplifies these challenges by providing organizations with machine learning detection and automated response capabilities to halt threats quickly. The platform also includes threat hunting, automated incident response, vulnerability management, honeypots, darknet exposure monitoring, compliance reporting and monitoring, and more. Join the conversation and see how Adlumin can enhance your security program without increasing your workload. Visit adlumin.com.
And now, back to the podcast.
I think you made a great point in there, which is that not every vendor should have access to all of your data. Some vendors might need access to data that's not that sensitive, and some vendors might need access to more critical information. And I think we can really focus our resource management in that way on the vendors that are accessing and touching more critical things or have more access.
Yeah, it's like least privilege for employees, right? We would do the same thing. Mark works in one department. He doesn't need access to another department's information. And it completely makes sense to me. And I think that's what we don't necessarily do. We kind of go in there with this flat environment of an open trust. Where I think it's the most concerning to me is either where they are a critical gateway in the security realm, like a managed service provider as an example, a security vendor, file sharing for critical, highly confidential information, those kind of things is one. And then the other area I think is the DevOps, where we're seeing more and more of this, the poisoning of the well, where the criminals are getting in, they're getting administrative development access, and they are able to augment code, add code. And frankly, when it comes to AI, this one scares me even more because, artificial intelligence is for most people just a black box and something cool they watch in sci-fi. And as it gets more complex, not to say it isn't already, fewer and fewer people are going to understand it. And it becomes harder and harder, I think, to understand the outcome, right? Like we can do basic AI sort of detection in the sense of we've written it to catch these kinds of things. And does it do it? Yes or no? But what we don't know is, has the well been poisoned? So, maybe it's really good at catching a bunch of bad stuff, except if that bad stuff happens to be that one particular criminal's gangs that's done it. It's going to knock out everyone else in the environment, but it's going to let their stuff go through because it's blind. The data was skewed or it was somehow trained not to recognize it for what it is.
Great point. Anything else you'd like to add, Mark?
Yeah, I said earlier, kind of off the cuff, that, often it's the business that makes a decision and drives the adoption of technology and services and so on. And that's, I think, at the end of the day, always going to happen. Who's got the checkbook, who has the motivation, and the need is going to be the ones in the driver's seat. But if we can get the security people in earlier before the ink is drying on the contract, it gives you a better opportunity to understand demarcation, right? To understand obligation. If you look at some of the indemnification that occurs, some of the last major supply chain breaches have shown that it's like, okay, well, if something happens on our watch, you get, let's say, some X value of your annual license value. And, maybe you get 2 years worth of licensing. Well, that's great if you're a small company and you get 10 grand back. 10 grand, as you know, doesn't go particularly far if your company has been shut down with ransomware, right? So I think this is where we're going to wake up to a bit of that kind of indemnification, which is this, well, we'll just give you back our service for free for a period of time, is not enough, where it's got to be, no, that doesn't actually reflect, or, it's not the same magnitude of what the potential risk and the damage is. So you got to start covering this, right? You have to provide assurance. Like, what are you doing? What kind of warranty do you have? How much would you be covered if this were to occur? And how do we work that one out? Who's on the hook for what? Because you know what it's like when these things happen. The lawyers are the only ones that get rich out of it.
Yeah, it's funny that you make that comparison because I liken that to going to a restaurant and having a bad meal. And then they say, well, come back and here, we'll give you another one.
Yeah, exactly.
So that might not be what you want.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's terrific. Yeah, I'm never eating here again. I got food poisoning. That didn't cover my hospital bill. That's exactly it. I think there's a lot of things that we just took for granted. And I think that's because we're driven by different motivators, right? We're like, well, I need this tool. This tool, like I said, it streamlines our business or expands our business in some way. And those kind of details, humans are terrible at long-term risk. So we don't eat our vegetables and we smoke, or we don't exercise enough. Right. And then years later, we're shocked when, our health is deplorable. And I think it's the same thing. We sign this all giddy, and then we start driving our car and we realize like, oh, that piece wasn't warranted, or, oh, that's going to be really expensive to repair. And we're all mad because in our mind, we sort of set this misconception that it would be covered, and it's not. I think that's it, right? So it's like, let the buyer beware and really look at the fine print and get your legal experts in place to understand if your risk is $2 million and the indemnification that you're going to get from them is $20,000, you got to ask yourself, who's making up that gap? Is that you or is it them?
Mark, always a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise.
For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engle. Cybertide is a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com.